This is week 2 of Kant's critique of pure reason. This week, we're going to look more closely at Kant's doctrine of transcendental idealism. We saw last week that Kant proposes transcendental idealism as his Copernican revolution in metaphysics. And this week, we're going to look at the 3 leading interpretations of transcendental idealism put forward by Peter Strawson, Henry Allison, and Lucy Allais. Recall from the B preface that the main claims of transcendental idealism are that the objects of our cognition must conform to our cognition of them, and that our cognition is of appearances only, while things in themselves are actual, but unknowable by us. Now, Strawson puts forward what's called a two-world phenomenalist interpretation. Phenomenalism is the thesis that objects are either identical to mental states, or objects depend for their existence on particular mental states. Now, on a phenomenalist view, objects have the same ontological status as hallucinations. So let's think about hallucinations. If I'm having a hallucination of a pink elephant, what do we want to say about that pink elephant? We might say all that's going on in the case of a hallucination is that I'm having a particular mental state, and that the pink elephant I'm hallucinating is just that mental state. Alternatively, you might think that there's a distinction between the mental state that constitutes my hallucinating and the image that I'm having a hallucination of. But even in this case, as soon as I stop hallucinating, the image goes away. So the image exists only insofar as I'm currently in this particular state of hallucinating. So on Strawson's interpretation of Kant's transcendental idealism, the same goes for the objects of our knowledge. The objects of our knowledge are either simply parts of our mental states, or they're like hallucinations or images whose existence directly depends on the particular mental state of knowing them. So that's Strawson's account of appearances. What about things themselves? Strawson holds a two-world interpretation of transcendental idealism because he thinks that things in themselves are different objects, indeed different kinds of objects than appearances. Strawson thinks that things in themselves are the mind-independent objects that affect us in order to give rise to the mental states that are appearances. Now, there are a number of problems for Strawson's interpretation. Strawson himself thinks transcendental idealism is nonsensical. Strawson's program for interpreting Kant is to attempt to distinguish transcendental idealism from what Strawson regards as Kant's positive achievement. Kant's achievement, according to Strawson, is identifying the general structure of any experience that would be possible for us. Strawson thinks Kant is simply mistaken in attempting to explain why experience must have a certain general structure in terms of the forms and the nature of the mind. Now, this is a very uncharitable reading of Kant. It has us disregarding and rejecting a great deal of what Kant has to say. And not just that, Kant himself seemed to think that transcendental idealism was an indispensable part of his account of the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge. Another problem for Strawson is that Kant himself repudiates Berkeley's phenomenalism. As I explained last week, this was one of the main motivations for Kant to write the Prolegomena, and Kant is explicit that the reason he rejects Berkeley's phenomenalism is that it equates objects in space and time to hallucinations, or mere illusions. A second sort of problem for Strawson's interpretation is that Kant clearly thinks the objects of our possible knowledge are public, in the sense that various people can have knowledge of the same object. But if all the objects that I had knowledge of were either my own mental states or dependent on my own mental states, then you and I couldn't have knowledge of the very same object. And as we'll see, as we read on in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant holds that the objects of our knowledge stand in causal relations amongst one another. And it's hard to see how this could be if objects either were or were existentially dependent on one's own mental states. Another problem for Strawson's interpretation is that Kant repudiates the two-world reading in a footnote in the B preface to the Copernican revolution passage. Kant explains that on transcendental idealism, the same objects can be considered from two different sides. On the one side, of objects of the senses and the understanding for experience, and the other side as objects that are merely thought for an isolated reason striving beyond the bounds of experience. Now, this suggestion that objects can be considered on two sides motivates Henry Allison's reading. Allison proposes a one-world epistemological interpretation. The key move that Allison makes is introducing the notion of an epistemic condition. Allison defines an epistemic condition as a condition that's necessary for our representation of objects. Allison thinks that the main argumentative sections of the critique are trying to show that there are epistemic conditions, namely that space, time, and the categories are epistemic conditions. conditions that make it possible for us to have knowledge of objects. Now for Allison, Kant's idealism consists in the claim that appearances are things insofar as they can be represented by us, or that appearances are things insofar as they conform to our epistemic conditions. But these things are not different things, or different kinds of things, than things in themselves, on Allison's interpretation. Instead of having a two-world interpretation, Allison has a one-world interpretation. For Allison, things in themselves are the very same things as appearances, but now considered independently of the conditions that are necessary for us to represent them. One objection that's commonly raised against Allison's interpretation, however, is that it trivializes transcendental idealism. The thought here is that while Kant proposes transcendental idealism as a revolutionary hypothesis akin to Copernicus's, Allison's interpretation renders transcendental idealism the thesis that we can have knowledge of things only insofar as it's possible for us to have knowledge of them. So while Kant thinks he's performing a philosophical revolution in rejecting transcendental realism, on Allison's interpretation, all Kant is doing is saying you can't know what you can't know. Another problem for Allison's interpretation is that Kant's committed to things in themselves being more real than appearances, and Kant says throughout the critique that things in themselves ground appearances. On Allison's interpretation, things in themselves and appearances are merely two standpoints on the very same things. Things in themselves and appearances are just two ways of considering the same things. But the question is, how can one way of considering things be more real than another way of considering things? Or how can one way of considering things ground another way of considering things? To think about this a little more, take me, for example. Here's two ways of considering me. On the one hand, I'm a citizen of the United States. On the other hand, I'm a professor of Williams College. If you consider me as a citizen of the United States, then I have a right to vote in the US election. If you consider me as a professor at Williams College, I have a right to occupy an office, have a computer, teach courses. So different ways of considering me bring to light different rights that I have. But what would make one of these ways of considering me more real than the other? As I said, in Kant's theoretical philosophy, he's certainly committed to things in themselves being more real than appearances. But the problem is especially acute in Kant's moral theory. Kant thinks that as a thing in myself, I'm a free moral agent, responsible for my actions. But as an appearance, I'm a member of the causally deterministic world. Now, it's crucial for Kant that the free moral agent is more real than the causally determined appearance. And it's crucial that my moral decision-making can have an effect in the empirical world. But again, it's hard to see how Kant could say any of this if myself as a thing in myself and myself in appearance were just two ways of considering me. Now, Lucy Allais has proposed a third alternative. Like Allison, Allais proposes a one-world interpretation, but Allais rejects Allison's epistemological two aspects or two ways of considering interpretation of transcendental idealism, and instead proposes a metaphysical view. It's a metaphysical view that Allais is concerned to distinguish from Strawson's phenomenalist view. Allais proposes her interpretation by introducing the notion of a perceptional or experiential quality. More recently, Allais has called this a manifest quality. So a perceptional quality is a quality that objects have in relation to a possible perceiver. Looking bent is the first example Allais gives in her paper. Bent sticks look bent to us in standard viewing conditions, and straight sticks look bent to us when half submerged in water. In this case, we can distinguish the perceptional quality of the stick from its intrinsic quality. Being straight is an intrinsic quality of straight sticks, and being bent is an intrinsic quality of bent sticks. Straight sticks are straight, independent of anyone perceiving them as straight. Bent sticks are bent, independent of anyone perceiving them as bent. But in order for a stick to look straight or to look bent, there has to be a perceiver to whom the stick looks straight or looks bent. This is why looking straight and looking bent are perceptional or manifest qualities, while being straight or being bent are intrinsic qualities of objects. But now, another sort of quality that Allais introduces is what she calls an essentially perceptional quality, or an essentially manifest quality. This is a quality that objects have only in relation to a possible perceiver. And an example here are color properties on one plausible account of color. So the thought here is that redness, for example, is the quality of appearing red to standard perceivers in standard conditions. The thought is there's no distinction in the case of redness, between being red and having the quality of looking red. All there is to being red is looking red to standard perceivers and standard conditions. After all, being red is simply defined as looking red to standard perceivers and standard conditions. So this makes red an essentially perceptional, or an essentially manifest quality. It's a quality that objects have in relation to possible perceivers, and only in relation to possible perceivers. Now, what's helpful about this notion of an essentially perceptional, or essentially manifest quality for allays, is that it's a quality of objects, rather than a mental state, and yet it's a mind-dependent quality of objects. It's a quality that objects have only in relation to a possible perceiver. Objects are red only if there's a possible perceiver to whom it could look red, but objects being red don't depend on any particular perceiver actually looking at them. Okay, so here's how allays uses this notion of an essentially manifest quality to interpret Kant's transcendental idealism. For allays, appearances are the essentially manifest qualities of things. So Kant's idealism consists in the claim that nothing that appears to us is an intrinsic quality of things, and moreover, nothing that appears to us is a merely perceptional or merely manifest quality of things. So while things appear square to us, nothing can be square. Things in themselves, for Kant, aren't different things, let alone different kinds of things, than appearances. Instead, things in themselves are the things that have the essentially manifest qualities that constitute appearances. And moreover, things in themselves have intrinsic properties that ground the essentially manifest qualities of things. If you think again about colors, we can give an explanation of why red things look red. This explanation will cite the underlying intrinsic qualities of the things. In this case, the quality to reflect certain wavelengths of light. So the intrinsic quality of absorbing certain wavelengths of light and reflecting other wavelengths of light grounds or explains why things have the color properties that they have. So in the same way, allays wants to say that things in themselves have intrinsic qualities, and that these intrinsic qualities of things in themselves ground the essentially manifest qualities of things in themselves, which constitute appearances. In allay's interpretation, Kant's claim that we can't know things in themselves amounts to the claim that we can't know these intrinsic properties of things. All we can know are the essentially manifest qualities of things that are grounded in these intrinsic qualities of the things. So we saw before, one way allays distinguishes her view from Strawson's. On her view, appearances are not mental states, and they don't depend for their existence on our mental states. We can see here another way allays distinguishes her view from Strawson's. While Strawson said appearances and things in themselves were two different worlds of objects, for allays there's just one world. There are things that have intrinsic properties as well as essentially manifest qualities. Allay distinguishes her view from Allison's by saying that the intrinsic qualities of things are more real than the essentially manifest qualities of things, and that the intrinsic qualities of things ground the essentially manifest qualities of things. Things' intrinsic qualities are more real in the sense that they're mind-independent. If every possible perceiver were to go out of existence, things would retain all of their same intrinsic qualities, while if every possible perceiver went out of existence, things would lose all of their essentially manifest qualities. So in this sense, the intrinsic qualities of things are more real than the essentially manifest qualities of things. So that's a brief sketch of three broad interpretive approaches to Kant's transcendental idealism. In your papers for this week, you might try to defend Strawson's or Allison's interpretation from some of the objections that I've raised, or other objections that you can think of. Alternatively, you might raise some objections to allay's interpretation and consider how she might respond. Of course, you haven't read much of Kant's critique yet, so there's a limit to what you can do in this regard. What you can do, though, is look back at Kant's Copernican Revolution passage. Here, Kant puts forward transcendental idealism in order to explain how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. So what you might consider is how, on your favorite interpretation of transcendental idealism, synthetic a priori knowledge becomes possible. This is something that allays doesn't do in her paper, so if you favor her interpretation, you could consider to what extent her interpretation helps us understand how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible for Kant.